Welcome back, everyone. A quick recap. This morning began with two detailed and insightful workshops. The first one titled Deep Learning Frameworks for Automatic Speech Recognition and NLP Models. This was conducted by Anima Shri Anand Kumar, who holds joint positions with Caltech and NVIDIA. Second workshop titled A Blueprint for Enterprise AI Adoption from Problem to Solution was led by Rishu Sharma of IDC India. There were some brilliant questions from the participants. Please do continue to engage with the next set of speakers. We now move on to the second leg of today's sessions. It is time for me to invite our next speaker for the next workshop, the next Deep Tech workshop. The topic is about the critical role of AI-powered geospatial analytics. The workshop will be driven by Anand S., CEO of Grameener Insights as Data Stories. Here's a brief introduction about the speaker. Anand is a co-founder of Grameener, a data science company. He leads a team that automates insights from data and narrates these as visual data stories. He is recognized as one of the India's top 10 data scientists, and he is a regular TEDx speaker. Anand is a gold medalist at IIM Bangalore and an alumnus of IIT Madras, London Business School, IBM, Infosys, Lehman Brothers, and BCG. Before Anand begins, another gentle reminder for the audience and the participants, please keep sending us your questions and our speaker will take them during or post their talk. Anand, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Praveen. Though I must add a bit to what you said, the stuff that I'm more proud of is one, the fact that I've typed out every single Calvin and Hobbes strip that ever existed. And second, that my daughters made me a Minecraft addict. So that is pretty much my identity at the moment, more than any of what you said. But today we're going to be talking about geospatial AI. And what I'm going to be looking at specifically is two things. One, what geospatial AI is and where can you apply it? This is the non-technical part of the talk. And the second is how you can use geospatial AI to build models. And this is the technical part of the talk. Generally, I found that these are for different audiences. So if you're non-technical, you can sleep in the second half and vice versa. But what I really want you to stay awake for is the first bit, which is where I'll be talking about what exactly geospatial AI is. And at some level, it's fairly straightforward. It's a subset of data science or AI, where we are talking about geography. More than looking at the numbers, we are looking at spaces, specifically geographic spaces, and understanding, firstly, where things are happening, what's unusual and where is it happening, and secondly, why is it happening? And the why part of it is the critical element here. Now, the reality is that we have so much geospatial data thanks to the plethora of satellites that are orbiting the planet. We have close to real-time feeds of pretty much any spot on Earth at any point, and the GPS is a reflection of the fact that we can always know where we are no matter what. But the reality is this is currently being used for example, pizza delivery, a whole lot more than it is being used to help emergency services. And I think partly this is a gap in our imagination, in that we aren't often thinking about what can I do with all of this data. So the first half of this session is really about what are the kinds of things that we can do to spark your imagination and hopefully get you to work on some use cases that you might not have considered before. Let's start with something that Stanford University did. They looked at a satellite imagery, which many of you are probably familiar with, the world shown at night, which you see on the right-hand side. The level of lighting is roughly a predictor of poverty level. And Stanford took this to the next level. They measured the level of light. They looked at the poverty levels in each of these regions and found that the correlation was extremely strong. Africa is the dark continent with reason. And the US, especially the East Coast and most of Western Europe, is brightly lit up. The West Coast of, the East Coast of China, all of Japan, extremely brightly lit up. And you can see that most of South America and most of the northern parts of Russia, Siberia, less populated. Most of Australia is also less populated. These are partly a combination of where people are, and secondly, how wealthy the people are, or roughly the wealth of that region. They took it to the next level. They said, what can we do to actually predict the per capita economic expenditure? Can we take, for example, a satellite image like what you see on the left-hand side and extract features from this? Where are the roads? Where are the urban areas versus where are the farmlands? Where are the waterways? And after splitting all of these, take the areas where people live and look at what the poverty levels are there. That's a pretty powerful application, because what that allows us to do is in nearly real time, see the wealth of people right across the world at any point. So this is not just seeing what's where, but deriving data from there. What other kinds of data could we derive? Well, we were playing around with this kind of stuff and took a leaf out of their notebook and said, can we predict wealth levels in India? And using the same kind of data, satellite data, and analyzing it, what we could find was on the right-hand side for each of the towns and cities in India, the actual wealth levels predicted, where red is less wealthy and green is wealthy, versus the actuals. These are actual per capita incomes plotted on the left-hand side. You'll find that there's a remarkably high correlation. When we measured it, it was well over 90%. And the inferences are reasonably clear and simple and reasonably well known as well. Most of the south of India and Punjab, northern Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, Haryana, these are wealthy. Whereas a fair bit of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, parts of Uttar Pradesh, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, a lot less wealthy. And the Northeast is a mix, with southern part of the Northeast being wealthier and the northern part being a lot less wealthy. There are discrepancies. So for example, what this is predicting is that some regions in Karnataka, for example, are not as wealthy as the actual levels are. There certainly are discrepancies. So I think this area near Mangalore, for instance, our prediction is red, low wealth, whereas in reality it is high wealth. So there are errors. And sometimes it's also insightful to go into why these errors are. And it's not just wealth related stuff that you can predict. You can even predict the type of roof that is being used, which is actually an indicator of lifestyle. So is it a clay roof? Is it a tile roof? Is it a brick roof? Is it a concrete roof? Glass, steel? And again, the predictions are fairly closely matched to reality. So now we are taking it a step higher, saying it's not just the overall wealth that we're predicting, but even attributes of wealth, such as what are the types of roofs people are using, or attributes of socioeconomic factors. And the kinds of things we can put it to use for range from, let's say, agriculture. One classic use case is crop type mapping. In different regions, what crops are being used. In another example, crop monitoring. Is a crop that is being planted doing well, or is it suffering from disease or damage? Precision farming and production control. What is the yield level? Should I farm the crop now? Should I let it grow further? Or from an insurance perspective, reviewing a region and saying, is this crop insurance worthy? Should I charge a higher premium, a lower premium? And a farmer who's unable to get insurance may be able to show the satellite imagery of a healthy crop far more easily and allow the premium to reduce considerably, given that their spot may be in a healthier position. Or urban analytics, smart cities. That's another area, another way of using this kind of data. Resource monitoring. Where do we have, for example, the farmlands? Where do we have forests? Where do we have buildings? Where do we have villages? Another is building footprint extraction. Can we look at the boundaries of each of these buildings? And that's something that's useful at a micro level to see, for example, whether they are exceeding the bounds. or at a macro level to see where the areas with buildings are present, and is that something that's going beyond the zones or is contained within the zones. Accessibility, can you get to a point? Livability, are the living conditions satisfactory? Is there access to, for example, drinking water nearby? And land use planning, is there enough area reserved for greenery? Is there enough area reserved for forestry? Is there enough area reserved for plantation? Location intelligence is another powerful use case, looking at the evolution of land over time. It's possible, in fact, quite accurate when we predict what the price of land could be in that particular region. Another is geomarketing. Where should organizations set up their offices, set up their shops? Effectively, where are the populated regions and where should they be advertising potentially? Is a particular site suitable for construction? Is this the right place where we want to set up stuff? Or solid waste management. If a landfill is nearing 80% coverage or is 80% filled, then we'll want to start planning to move stuff out of that. So the efficiency of such systems become much higher. Disease outbreak monitoring and control. I will be talking a lot more about this in a more detailed example that I'll be going in through. Are there forest fires that have popped up? How are they spreading and which direction are they spreading in? Property tax is something that can be automated. Even election campaigns, where should people be conducting their next set of visits and how should this be compared with competition and demographics? If one party has a policy that is, well, crudely put, pro-wealthy versus another party that is pro-poor, then where should they be planning their next set of campaigns is something that one can get from geospatial AI. And the basis for all of this is simply the fact that there is a whole lot more data available today on the geospatial side. And we have the intelligence and the ability, thanks to AI, to process the raster data, that is the satellite imagery, and convert it to meaningful information. Now, so far I've been talking about what we've been able to do and what are some of the things that we could do in the future. Now, let me go into the second part, which is how exactly do we go about doing this? What is the technology that's available here? And finally, I will end with a deep dive into technology for one specific use case. Firstly, let's take a look at the data. Now, geospatial data is available in two forms, raster and vector. Vector is basically where you have line drawings. For example, if you have a floor plan which indicates the boundary of every room, that's a vector drawing. A photo of a room is raster. It's an image. And vector data is generally a whole lot easier to process. So very often we take raster data and convert that to vector data in some shape or form. One of the advantages of vector data is that you can overlay them. So for example, if you take pretty much any kind of geographic region, you can start with what's the base layer, kind of like you've seen Google Maps, right? You can add a layer on top of it with the KML files, or you can add a layer on top of it with, let's say, traffic, with the traffic density. Those are the kinds of layers that you can add to any vector data. And the crux of it is that it has points expressed in, well, roughly latitudes and longitudes, and it draws shapes using those. And each of those shapes can have numbers associated with it, such as population, for example. The other kind of data is raster data, where we have a picture, typically a satellite image of a particular region. And the color of that is encoded using a set of filters into numbers. A crude way of thinking about it is the darker values, the darker colors are lower values and the lighter colors are higher values. Effectively, there would be some scale or set of scales against which we can take pretty much any region in a photograph and convert that into numbers. But the difference is that with geospatial raster images, they are tagged to a particular latitude and longitude, which means that if we say this is a picture It also comes associated with where exactly each pixel in that picture is on the surface of the planet. That's the two kinds of data sets that we have to play around with. I will be, at least in the next example, talking you through some sources where you could get these data sets. Once you have this information, what can we do? Well, the first is you need to store it. The good part is the storage technology has improved to the point where it is almost standard in that there isn't too much difficulty in storing geospatial data. PostGIS, which is a plugin to Postgres, is a powerful open source geospatial storage system. MongoDB supports geospatial storage, so does Oracle Spatial, Neo4j Spatial. Each have their advantages and disadvantages, and there are several other emerging tools. The standard today, at least the most popularly used one in the open source community, is PostGIS for obvious reasons. It's the most mature and most robust solution. What can we do with such tools? Well, first, we can store the data, but more importantly, we can start querying the data. We can ask questions like, for example, which is the biggest shape? We can also deal with the different kinds of shapes that are there. Sometimes we want to put in markers, a point saying this is the center of Delhi, for example, or this is 10 Janpath. Sometimes we want to have lines indicating that this is the national highway number 14 from this point to this point. Or we may have polygons, regions that indicate a boundary. And geospatial databases allow us to store all of these kinds of data. But they're primarily used for vector data of this kind, as opposed to storing images of satellite data. They can be stored in some geospatial databases, but geospatial databases are far more friendly to vector data. That's partly because you can query these, you can do more stuff with vector data than you can with raster data. Now, that's where you store the data, but how do you go about doing stuff with it? Well, again, the ecosystem for tools and platforms have emerged and have become pretty mature. Solutions like Mapbox or Carto, they are pretty good at helping you see the data. Google Earth is a user-friendly way of both exploring data sets on the planet as well as just taking walkthroughs and so on. But there are also tools like Esri, Esri is a company, ArcGIS or QGIS that help you manipulate this data as well. And when I say manipulate, what you can do is ask questions like, let's take an election example. Supposing I have a constituency and I need to know how many people are there in my constituency, but nobody's given me that information. On the other hand, the census computes the size, the population by each district. Now, my district, my constituency, has 30% of district A and 40% of district B. How do I know that? Because that's the amount of area of district A and district B that it overlaps. So I could roughly say that the population could be uniformly distributed in a district, maybe, let's assume, and then take 30% of the population from district A, 40% of the population from district B, and use that as the population for my constituency. Now, in order to do this calculation, I need to know that 40% of district B is in my constituency. How does one do that calculation? So that's an example of what's called a spatial join. And that's an example of the kind of operation that this allows. Now, spatial joins are useful in almost every kind of processing. Let's take another example. A bank says, I have, here is my territory manager, and my territory manager has a certain territory. Now, this covers pin code X, Y, and Z, but only 40% of pin code Z and 60% of pin code Y and 20% of pin code X. Now I want to know what the population of my territory is so that I can figure out what is the kind of budget I should be allocating for this territory. That's an example of a calculation that you could figure out by using geospatial joins. And those are examples of calculations that these tools can provide. They also allow you to break up territories, join territories, pretty much treat map shapes like numbers or database tables. So that's one level of processing that you can do on a geospatial database. The other level of processing that you can do on a geospatial database is through libraries. And this is an ecosystem that is pretty powerful as well. What I'm showing here on the screen is a list of Python-based libraries, Python, the programming language. And these are popular libraries. Each has its own set of uses that processes geospatial data. I'm going to touch upon maybe a couple of them. For example, GeoPandas is a very powerful and intuitive way of processing vector data, whereas Raster.io, as the name suggests, is a very powerful way of processing raster geospatial data. GDAL is a low-level library that's below GeoPandas and a bunch of other libraries here that provides low-level support. But depending on your needs, depending on your familiarity, you may work with one or more of these libraries. And the important thing is that these allow you to write your own programs, write your own models to work with geospatial data. So how exactly does one do that? Well, to do that, I'm going to start with a specific example, a specific piece of work that we were playing around with. This began, at least for us, when we were told by one of our clients, asked actually, this specific question. What do you think is the most dangerous animal on our planet? Now, when people are surveyed, this is the answer that they give in order. Number 1, sharks. Number 2, crocodiles. Number 3, snakes, lions, then mosquitoes, and dogs. Well, how do we even define what's the most dangerous? One way of defining what's most dangerous is which has killed the most number of humans. That's a pretty reasonable definition. And if you define it that way, mosquitoes by far outweigh anything else. 7.5 times more deadly than snakes, which in turn are about 3 times as deadly as dogs, which in turn are almost 8 times as deadly as crocodiles. And in a year, only 6 people die because of shark deaths. But 100,000 more people die because of mosquitoes. That is the deadliest animal on the planet. And our client, the World Mosquito Program, they had the task of curbing this menace. Their objective was, let's stop the 400 million dengue infections we have each year that are spreading across as many as 80 odd countries. And more than a third of the world's population is at risk. In fact, every 4 minutes, there's a case of chikungunya that's confirmed somewhere in the world. It's a pretty serious problem. And their solution to this problem is a bacteria called the Wolbachia. So it's a bacteria that naturally exists in some insects and including sometimes in mosquitoes. But the thing is that if a mosquito has this bacteria, it does not transmit viruses to people effectively. But otherwise, it's safe to the mosquitoes, for those of you who are concerned about the mosquitoes. And therefore, if we can infect a mosquito with Wolbachia, our infection risk is reduced. The good part about this is that these infected mosquitoes, they actually breed. So once you infect a mosquito and it breeds, all of its offsprings also have the Wolbachia virus, a bacteria. So which means that they won't be able to spread infection either. And what that means is that if you take a wild mosquito population and release Wolbachia in a small portion, over time, Wolbachia will spread to the bulk of the rest of the population simply through breeding. And from that perspective, it can be a pretty cost-effective way. The only trouble is that catching mosquitoes and infecting them with Wolbachia is a pretty expensive process. And therefore, from a release perspective, you have to release them very carefully. And you want to release them only in areas which have a high urban population. So in general, they pick these areas extremely carefully. For example, in North Queensland, there were 40 release locations that were carefully chosen where there was the highest population. They also had to work with the city authorities to get permission to release these in locations. You can't just arbitrarily release, well, mosquitoes anywhere. But it has proven to be effective. So post the release for 8 years, the region has been dengue free. Up to then, there were anywhere from 20 to 80 cases that kept coming up. But post the release of the Wolbachia viruses for 8 years, there have been no infections and the area is declared dengue free. Where to release the mosquitoes, however, is a tricky problem. And the reason it's tricky is because, firstly, there are a series of operational issues. First, you've got to release it to within a 50 to 100 meter radius of where the highest population is. That's how far it spreads initially. And they've got to be effective in that unless the Wolbachia infected mosquitoes breed with other mosquitoes, there is no effectiveness. And obviously we've got to only release in populated areas. So we've got to specifically pick the highest population density areas. But the reality is that a highly populated, I don't know, let's say 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area may have a huge tenement of flats in one corner and is farmland everywhere else. Obviously, we want to release it in the tenement of flats, not in the middle of the farmland. So you've got to also look at the ground and see where you want to release it. That apart, it's a pretty people-intensive process. The first is that you've got to work with the local agencies, the organizations. It takes a fair bit of time and effort to collect the people to release these mosquitoes. And secondly, you also have a technology problem. Firstly, finding out where the population is high. Second, what do we need to make sure that this is delivered to the right place at the right time? All of that causes a problem. So if they get the location wrong, it's pretty tricky. So what we were working with them on was how can we accurately identify the exact release location in any given city. So here's the specific problem. If we had population data at a granular level, great. Then we just say, go release it at the highest locations, or at least investigate those locations. And if for any reason that doesn't work, go to the next backup location. So it's ideally what we want is to give them a reasonably small, let's say 100 meter by 100 meter area, saying, this is your number 1 release area, number 2 release area. Give them a list of say 100. And if for any reason, let's say 50 of them don't work, you still have the remaining 50. Now, unfortunately, this data is either outdated or inaccurate or unavailable. So one of the best sources, accuracy-wise, and that is reasonably updated, is what's called the Gridded Population of the World, GPW. I mentioned earlier that I talk about what kinds of sources exist, and for population, this is one of the better sources, and that's publicly available. The trouble is it's at a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer resolution. Now, like I said, exploring a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area to find out what is the right release point requires too much effort. In fact, it takes weeks, sometimes months to do this across multiple locations. So we need to get this down at least 100 times better. That is 100 meter by 100 meter grid, which is a whole lot more tractable. You can see the region and say, okay, fine, this looks like a good spot. This is not such a good spot. So the task was this: apply geospatial AI by taking the gridded population of the world data. That's step 1. Okay. So that at least gives you a starting point saying within a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer region grid, you know what the population is. And then take the satellite imagery. Now, from the satellite imagery, we should be able to extract the building footprints. And given the building footprint data, we should be able to say, let's say this is broken up into 4 grids. So on the top right, the building area is, let's say, 20%. Bottom right, let's say it's 40%. Bottom left, let's say it's 40%. Top left, let's say it's only 10%. So then I can say 20, 40, 40, 10. That's a total of 110. If my total population in this region was, let's say, 110,000 people, then I can say that the top right corner has 20,000 people, because roughly equal area of building can correlate to equal population. Is that a good measure? Yes. Is that a perfect measure? No. And do we want to choose perfect over good? This proved to be one of the better approximations. And when the world mosquito, the WMP team looked at this measure, they said, yeah, this is what we want to go with. It gives us the best balance between robustness and accuracy. So given two data sets, one, population of the world by grid, and second, building footprint data, what we can do is a join that combines these two and gives us at a 100-meter by 100-meter level what exactly is the population, and then pick the top ones from those. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is go even deeper into the technology and show you how exactly this was done. I'm going to do that by diving into a Jupyter notebook, which shows you the exact mechanism. This is the point at which the non-technical people will want to retune themselves, not to look at the code that I'm going to show, but rather to look at how you, or what are the things that you'll need to be telling your teams to be able to do this. The technical people can wake up now. So one of the regions the WMP was releasing the Wolbachia infected mosquitoes was at Kampala in Uganda. And this is the satellite imagery. It's one of the largest cities in Uganda. So what we did was first decided on the libraries that we needed. I mentioned a whole bunch of libraries earlier. The primary libraries we used were one, GeoPandas, which I said is pretty good with vector data. And the other is Raster.io, which I mentioned is pretty good with raster data. The rest are derived libraries just to plot stuff, but these are the two primary libraries that we used. Now, given this, the next step is to start by getting the overall boundary. Now, how does one get the boundary of a city like Kampala? Well, the good part is boundaries of most cities are publicly available. So this is a Uganda energy data site, and it has the boundaries for Kampala, which is dated 2014, and Kampala hasn't really changed boundaries since then. So using GeoPandas, we were able to read this file, downloading it from which, and I got this just from an internet search. And this is what the shape of Kampala looks like. Of course, it's cut off at the bottom, but let's not worry about that. So now we know what the boundary of Kampala looks like. The next step is now to take the data set from the Microsoft population count. From the gridded population of the world. The gridded population of the world data set, this is hosted at columbia.edu, is where you can download data sets once you log in, pretty much for, in a variety of different data sets. And you can choose whether you want the data set for a single year or multiple year, and at what resolution. The most granular resolution, as you can see, is the 1 kilometer grid size. So this is the data set that I had downloaded, and it comes through as a TIFF file, and specifically a TIFF file that has the coordinates of each of these regions. So the thing is, the gridded population of the world data set doesn't really care about Kampala. It says, I'm going to give you the population of the world. Now you pick the region that you want. So how do we pick just the region that we want? Well, we know the bounds of Kampala, and we know that because we got that from the Kampala boundary. So we figure out what the top left, bottom right corners of Kampala are, and we extract just that portion that says, so this is the population in and around Kampala. Now, what you'll see is that while we've overlaid the boundary of Kampala on the gridded population of the world data set, some regions are clearly outside of it and some are inside of it. The good part is there isn't too population outside, but we obviously have to crop the population to the bounds of Kampala, otherwise things will go for a toss. So that's one of the things that we'll be coming to in a short while. Now, the thing is, this is a raster image. I told you earlier that raster images are like photographs where each latitude, longitude grid has some value. In this case, that value is population. What we need to do is convert this not into a region, but not into a block of pixels, but rather into a latitude, longitude set of points, a rectangle that can be processed so that we can merge it and then say, just this particular part of this grid is part of Kampala, the rest of this grid is not. Just this portion of the grid is part of Kampala, the rest is not. To be able to do that kind of trimming and cropping, we need to convert it to raster data. And that's where a library like Raster.io comes in. What we do is read the JSON file. That's what we want to clip it into. And then use Raster.io to take that TIFF file and convert it to a a vector image, which is in GeoJSON. GeoJSON is, well, TIFF, as you probably know, is an image format, the kind that SLR cameras export. GeoJSON is a format that has geographic JavaScript objects, and that's a vector format. And this is what it looks like. This particular region has a population of 432 point something people. This particular region has a population of 405 point something people, and so on. And this is the shape of that region. So now that we've converted it into a vector format, we can have more nuanced regions. All of these regions have a total population of something. All of these regions have a total population of something. And the color of these regions gives you a rough sense of where the population is located. So what we've done so far is taken the satellite imagery, which was overlaid with population data, which came from Microsoft's building footprints. I forgot to mention where this came from. So Microsoft building footprints is an open data set that has data for the US, Canada, and luckily Uganda and Tanzania, which holds the shape of each of these buildings. And I'll come to this in a bit. Oh, sorry. I got ahead of myself. Hold on the building footprint bit. Right now, what we have is the population broken up by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid. Now, let's skip this. Now that we have the population of each of these regions, the next step is to convert these into 100 meter by 100 meter grids. For this, we are going to use building data, so that where there are more buildings, there is more population. Where there are less buildings, there is less population. And for that, we load the building footprints from the Microsoft building footprints data set, which has vector data for each of these regions, showing what the building footprint exactly is. So what that means is that if this were 100 meter by 100, if this were say 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid, and I split it up into 4 quadrants, I know that the bottom right quadrant and the top right quadrant have a reasonable number of buildings, but the bottom left quadrant has fewer buildings, and I'll be able to assign a smaller population to that place. So what we do is read that building footprint data set, and what it has is for each region, what is the area of buildings. So it's not just the number of buildings. It tells me that this particular building has a smaller area, this particular building has a larger area. And once we have this kind of a data set, if you take a quick look at what it's like in Kampala, this is what it looks like. Each of these little regions is the footprint of a building, and the area for these is something that we have available. Then, once we have this, we can use a GeoPandas function called spatial join. What that does is takes 2 data sets. One, the building footprint data, where we know where the buildings are. Second is the grid population data. And then once you join them, it takes both of those data sets and creates a combined data set that says in this particular region, this is the population and this is the building area. In this case, there's no buildings here, so it wouldn't assign any population there, and so on for the entire data set. And what we can do with this, okay, and one more thing that we need to do is crop off anything outside just at the edge of Kampala. So I have, let's say this region, which is mostly outside Kampala. Take off maybe 20% of that area because the population living there doesn't really live in the Kampala region, and the Kampala census would not count that. So once we do that and adjust for the total population, the net result that we get is Starting from a grid of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer that shows this kind of a population density, we get to a far more granular grid like this that shows what the population density is. And from here, it becomes easy to pick the top 50 spots. Just pick the 50 most red spots that are kind of spread out a little further. Once we have this, what do they do with it? Well, firstly, what they were able to do is reduce the effort like crazy. Instead of 3 weeks, it took just 2 hours to figure out what are the spots that they need to release the mosquitoes in. Second, it was more accurate than their original plans, 70% more accurate to be precise. And not just that, over time, as the population changed and as they wanted to monitor the release of mosquitoes and validate it, the efficiency, the speed at which the amount of time that they needed to do this reduced by half. So some very real savings there. But from a technologist perspective, there are a few things that I'd like you to take away as well. First is that spatial joins are a really powerful thing today. We have so many data sets that geography by default provides us a way of combining them. And these are spatial joins, the equivalent of relational joins in relational databases. Second, from a library perspective, GeoPandas and Raster.io are your go-to, and you are going to be able to do pretty much any kind of modeling with these that don't involve feature extraction, which is a different ballgame altogether. But thirdly, that feature extraction is a critical capability that exists today, that given pure satellite imagery, you can actually extract pretty much any kind of information that could be logically inferred from there, including things like where you should be releasing mosquitoes with a certain amount of logical inference. This is going to be released across 10 countries, being released across 10 countries, and they are using for their planning effectively all of the capabilities in geospatial AI. So with that, what I want to end with is just one message, that geospatial AI is a very real thing. It's something that is literally saving lives today, and is something that I hope all of you will be using with a lot more effectiveness going forward. And hopefully you've gotten a sense of the kinds of things that you can do with geospatial AI, as well as, more importantly, how to do some of those things with geospatial AI. With that, over to you for Q&A.
Anand, thank you so much. It was a very well laid out workshop going into each of the steps. I think, from a takeaway perspective, you sort of broke it down very well. And the example in Uganda, in terms of how you started out by obtaining the footprint data, the population of the world at a grid level, and then bringing those two data sets together in order to make or at least help authorities take those informed decisions. I think that's very nicely put. Thank you again. And there are a few questions from the audience. So on behalf of Nitin, I'd like to ask you a question. So he asks how geospatial AI can be used in the mining and oil industry.
I have no exposure to the mining and oil industry, Nitin. So I must confess that anything that I'm about to share, you'll have to take with a pinch of salt. My idea is to give you ideas, not give you answers, because if you take any of these, then I would be applying my chemical engineering degree from 25 years ago, which I've never applied in 25 years. But, well, I don't know, but maybe if you use the satellite imagery, the type of soil, perhaps the color, perhaps the heat signature is different based on different kinds of minerals that would be available in different regions. If so, then you have a chance of using that satellite imagery data to figure out where to locate or where to mine for different kinds of minerals. But from a more mundane perspective, another possibility is, even if you know where these mines are, if you actually want to, let's say, open up the mine shaft, it's got to be in a place that's somewhat far away from where there's any protected wildlife, where there's any settlement of people, where there's any industry. And all of that is something that's going to be pretty hard to find manually if you start going through even satellite imagery, of course, even harder if you go there physically to inspect it. So instead, a model like this could well be useful. From an oil perspective, well, if there is an oil spill, then if you want to map the extent of the oil spill at a high cost, one possibility is to send, I don't know, a commercial helicopter to that region. But a less expensive one is to use live satellite imagery. And it's large enough and the resolution high enough that you will be able to track that with close to public or relatively low expense data. So that's an example. The idea is this. Imagine that you have a super eye in the sky, and imagine that you have a super brain in the computer. With a combination of these, what becomes possible is the question to ask, really. I say super eye because the resolutions are improving, and I say super brain because largely we don't necessarily know what can be inferred. I mean, we haven't sat in the sky and looked at the ground to see what patterns there are, right? But with enough training data, the systems can figure out things irrespective of whether we believe or know that we can or not. So sometimes it's just a matter of saying, can we do this? Try it out, see what the model accuracy is. If it's good enough, great.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for answering that for Nitin. There's one more question, Anand, and this is from Ayushi. So while she thanks you for a very interesting session, she asks if you could elaborate on the damage assessment in agriculture, specific to diseases or damage through fire or damage to the soil. How do you think that could be achieved with techniques like the way you described today?
So the principle is exactly the same. We take satellite imagery and look at where there is damage to the crop or where there is wastage due to fire or whatever. How does one go about doing that? Well, to begin with, we'll have to have some training data set. So one is have someone look at, say, 1,000 photos or 10,000 photos and mark the regions that are damaged and feed that into a computer vision algorithm. What that will do is keep getting trained, saying, if I see this pattern of pixels, then it's likely to be damaged, likely to have a blight, likely to have a fire, each of the things that you train it on. And over time, it'll figure out based on the colors, based on neighboring colors, based on changes in colors, it'll figure out that this is the pattern that it needs to apply. It may get it wrong, but over time, it will improve the more that you train it on. The good part is these kinds of things are not something you necessarily need to train on. So one of the disadvantages of AI is the need for enormous volume. But the advantage is that in fields like geospatial intelligence, the data sets are often in the hands of governments and public bodies who have both the resources and the intent to create large-scale systems and expose them out publicly. So models, you don't even necessarily need to build a model, for example, for detecting fire or building footprint. These models publicly exist. Models for identifying floods are being released on a regular basis. Models for you just saw models for population you just saw a short while ago. So you don't even need to have the people drawing these shapes. Instead, it's partly a function of searching for the right model on the internet, or searching for the right model, or the right people who know who might be building these models in their research labs or universities, and using them instead. So in summary, first, it's a recognition that it's possible. The second is either training the data set because you have enough data, or finding the trained data set from someone or somewhere on the net.
All right, Anand, and talking about that data set, which is available either publicly or with the people who are actually working on these data sets, how good is the quality and the availability of such data pertinent to specific problems, some of the problems that you highlighted, use cases that you highlighted in your presentation?
I have never seen a data set that is so bad that it's not worth having. Put it that way. So let's put it this way. Supposing you have a data set with utterly terrible quality. What are your choices? Use it, not use it, right? Like I said, I am yet to see a data set that is so bad that you'd rather not use it. It always improves your intelligence. So what would it mean for a data set to not have high quality? Well, one possibility is it could be outdated. Sure. So we work with old data, and the implicit assumption we are making is that things haven't changed maybe for 10 years. Would things have changed for 10 years? Absolutely. Question is, do you have a better alternative? And with geospatial intelligence, the better alternative is generally status quo, which is what we've been doing for 40, 50 years, is what we continue. I think we know which is the better data set here, really. So data quality is rarely the problem. Having said that, I would say that every effort needs to be made to improve the data quality. And that's by seeing if we can find better data sets. So in this case where I was talking about the World Mosquito Program, we made every effort to find the most accurate population data set and most robust population data set that existed. That's worth doing. The second thing is what we don't have, can we improve? So in this particular case, we didn't have data at 100 meter by 100 meter level. So option A, this data is so bad that we don't go with it. Never a good idea. Option B, this data is the best that we can do. Go with it. An acceptable idea. But what we did in this case was refine this data with another data set as a proxy, making some approximations. So it is possible to do a certain amount of autocorrection on such data sets. That's a third stage to use. So in summary, I'd say don't drop a data set for poor quality. Find better data sets and try to improve what you get.
All right, thank you for that, Anand. We have Madhusudan who has asked a question, and Madhusudan says, in your use case, did you have a mechanism to build a feedback loop by monitoring the effect of measures taken, such as mosquitoes released or subsequent decrease in the infectious mosquito population? I mean, he was wanting to probe further by asking if there was any scope for any correlations with disease spread prior and subsequent to these interventions.
So firstly, the World Mosquito Population team monitors this very closely, in that they're looking at the total number of cases that are that come up post facto. And I showed you in at least one region, North Queensland, where the number of cases in that region was tracked closely. But how much more granular can we get than that? Well, the ideal would be, can we actually spot the count of Wolbachia infected versus non-Wolbachia infected mosquitoes at any given point or region, right? That's a little hard. The good part is it's possible to spot mosquitoes, meaning using computer vision today, it's possible not just to count mosquitoes in a photograph at reasonably high resolution, but go as far as detecting the gender of the mosquito, which is in fact another mosquito control mechanism. But in this case, that's not what was being used. The best mechanism that exists right now is sampling. Catch, I don't know, say 1,000 mosquitoes, what proportion of those are infected, and see how that changes over time, which is also an expensive mechanism. So this has to be used somewhat judiciously. So short answer, at an aggregate level, yes, there is the possibility to correlate effectiveness based on overall control. But a more granular feedback mechanism needs better technology, and we may not be able to improve the models as fast as we would like.
All right, thank you, Anand. Dinesh has a question, and he goes, how to have a rough idea of the growth of population based on a region with the help of satellite images?
Got you, Dinesh. So growth, you'll need at least 2 data points. So beyond that, it's largely just extrapolation. So here's a very simple, crude approximation. Take satellite data for, let's say, 1 year ago. Take satellite data now. Calculate the building footprint density and say that if the density has increased 20%, the population growth in that particular 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer region is 20%. Is it possible to improve on that? Yes, absolutely. Because you could say that look, population just doesn't suddenly grow, it spills over into neighboring regions. So you could build a slightly more sophisticated model where the population is not simply a function of the previous population in that location, but is a combination of populations from the surrounding regions. That's another. And then you can go on building the population model with higher levels of complexity. This you would obviously want to temper with the accuracy. So you make a prediction using this and actually compare at an aggregate level how good your prediction is for the region. So you may say, well, I've got this growth using footprint data from last year to this year. Let me sum it up for the entire, say, district and see how well it matches, for how many states it matches, how many states it doesn't match. Now, if you had a lot of, if you had fairly granular aggregate data, then you can run a number of different tests and build very complex models and see which model fits best. But the reality is the reason why you would even be needing to do this model is because you don't have such good granular data in the first place. So you may have to keep your model reasonably simple, test approximately how accurate it is, do a little bit of tweaking and stop with that. So net, what you need as ingredients for this are: one, some proxy for population, which could be building footprint. You could choose light as the level of night light as a proxy, or any of a series of proxies. Second, satellite imagery for 2 periods. Third, aggregate population growth as a comparison metric for the same 2 periods. And with that, you'd be able to build your models.
Thank you, Anand. That was valuable. Anand, perhaps the last question here, and with the kind of potential that you highlighted through this example in Uganda, clearly there's a lot of possibility, and some of those use cases you've highlighted early on in your presentation. Now, you did touch upon a few. You didn't really call them out as limitations per se, but what is preventing us from seeing more of these applications at play?
Mostly lack of awareness. When the World Mosquito Program came to us and said they had something called a Wolbachia bacteria, whoa, okay, never heard of it. And then when we were talking about the possibility of extrapolating it to a more granular level using building footprints, they said, well, we've never heard of it. So it's, on the one hand, people with problems, and on the other hand, people with the technology coming together and creating something new. And that kind of creation is constantly happening more and more. So why haven't we seen more of it? Well, these people aren't talking to these people enough, mostly. So what does it take? Well, more forums like these, I guess.
Well, on that positive note, Anand, thank you very much. It was definitely a very informative workshop. Quite a lot of insights that you have brought to this particular topic and the kind of potential that it has for all of us. We appreciate you joining us. Thanks again, Anand.
Pleasure, Praveen. Thanks, everyone.